So we talked a lot about different tools for understanding mental health and potentially making new approaches to diagnosis and new ways of crunching data and sort of gain insights. So I think in this panel, we're sort of taking a step back and sort of thinking, like, what does all of this mean for the way we do science and the way we approach science and the methods that drive science? And I'm going to talk a bit about that from the perspective of my work, but also the perspective of what is a digital research lab? So that's the question that my talk will hopefully in some way answer. So I study cognitive function, and cognitive function is sort of a proxy for brain function. So by looking at differences in the way people process information about the world and other people and things around them, you can understand about how they vary in fundamental aspects of brain health. And when we think about a research study, you can think of sort of taking any research study, in humans anyway, and breaking it along two dimensions. So how many people are you studying? What's your sample size? And how well are you measuring them? So maybe how many measurements you're taking or how high quality your measurements are. So we can imagine that a typical laboratory study sits in this sort of feasibility space of, moderately many people tested moderately well or characterized moderately well. And then things like a genome-wide association study where you have many, many thousands and sometimes even hundreds of thousands of people who are tested, given sort of really coarse measurements. Maybe it's from electronic health records, maybe it's, a single question, and you really rely on the numbers in order to get your signal. And then you have things like patient HM, so the famous patient with bilateral medial temporal lobectomy who was unable to form new long-term memories, who was studied in great depth over 50 years, so extremely well characterized, but one person. So these are at the frontiers of science, but really we're trying to get into this no man's land now with precision medicine. We need to be able to characterize many, many people very, very well in order to make a dent in science that is a science of an individual. And that's in some ways in some ways, it's a really big challenge. Right, so how do we get from here to here? The brick and mortar lab is not going to get us there. So you think of the methods that have been developed over centuries now. So this is a simple reaction time experiment from 1920. Ways of capturing cognition, capturing behavior in highly, highly controlled settings, but also geographically limited settings, and that's by necessity. So the measurement tools were in specific locations, and you needed to bring people to the tools in order to do those measurements. So if you're going to capture cognition, you do it in a very controlled setting like this one. Of course, now we're in this world where we have digital tools, and those digital tools can be used in everyday environments to test hypotheses about the mind and brain. They can capture behavior outside of the four walls of a laboratory or clinic. And so really, we're taking the laboratory into a much less bounded space through these tools. But I think it would be overly simplistic to think of the digital laboratory as being about these tools. So this is not the digital lab. It's not an iPad or a tablet or a laptop. I would argue this is the digital lab. It's the 4.5 billion people from all over the world, and this number is growing, who have access to the internet, who potentially could be reachable to do assessments, to do measurements, to incorporate into our research studies through digital devices, through the web, through mobile health platforms. So the digital research lab, how do we use these methods to measure many? So now I'm taking that first y-axis from that original chart. 3 facts about people on the internet. So some of you have seen me give these facts before. Many of you are people on the internet, and in fact, I'd say probably most of you if you're at a conference like this. So I'm going to just abbreviate right after from here on and just say people. Fact 1. In the hierarchy of needs, so this is my adaptation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, participating in research tends to be fairly low priority, right? So you have your basic, oops, oh no, ignore that, that's getting rid of the punchline. So first, food, water, warmth, rest, security, safety, self-actualization. After you have self-actualized, you have to do things like Google your medical symptoms, look at cat pictures, shout at the internet. And then right up here, after eating kale, is participating in research. So I'm sorry to those of you who really enjoy kale. I personally don't find it very appetizing. But the idea is that this is not something that people are doing all the time and seeking to do. It is not something they wake up in the morning and think, how do I get involved in a local research study? So we have a huge challenge in engaging people because of the fact that this is not something that people do all the time. Fact 2, people share information they find interesting with their social networks through social media. I often like to accompany this slide with the question of what's the most cited paper in whatever the field is, the room I'm in, and no one knows. But most people, so raise your hand if you've seen this video of the guy on the left. Right, exactly, right? So we all know this stuff. It's the sort of information that penetrates networks really rapidly, that we remember, that we really get engaged with, and we share. So, okay, right? So what do you do then? Fact number 3, people love to learn anything about themselves. So the fact that these sorts of quizzes are done in extraordinarily large numbers is kind of amazing, right? These are kind of like self-report questionnaires. These are things that ask about your preferences, your behaviors, your thoughts, your feelings, how you think about the world. And then it digests all that information and tells you what kind of cat you are. These are research-like instruments. So how do we take the sort of intrinsic desire to self-classify or to understand oneself and drive that, use it as a driver for research? So the approach. 1, you have to minimize barriers to participation. If you have a form that someone has to send into a person who then signs a thing and they send you another thing and you have to send them a thing, it's just the person's not going to be in your research study. It's not going to happen. What kind of cat are you does not require 3 pages of demographics and questionnaires before you start doing it. Second, you share data and results with the participant. So the return of research results. We talk about it often as a fundamental value potentially in sort of thinking about the participant as a person who has a right to that data. And I think that's absolutely true. But there's also a very pragmatic reason to share research results. People like it. It gets them engaged in your studies and it makes them want to participate. And then finally, respect the person's lack of time. So in the brick and mortar lab, you bring people into a place, and while they're there, you do as many measurements as you can, because after they leave, you will probably not get them back. Here, you're going to lose them if you do more than some minimal set of measurements. And the idea is that through repeated engagements, that's how you get all the data, and through scale, that's how you get your data, as opposed to locking them somewhere for 4 hours and saying you're going to do all this. And not that we ever lock anyone in a room, but social demands locking, whatever. Respecting time. So Test My Brain looks a bit like this. This is a website that my colleagues and I developed back in 2008 to try to have an online laboratory where we can engage people in research studies and get large samples. This is constantly changing, so the experiments that are on the front page cycle through depending on what we're doing at that given month or week. This is what results look like. So people will do a study. It takes from 5 to 30 minutes, and then at the end they get their score, they get the average score, and they get a kind of percentile conversion of that score to understand where they lie in the normal distribution. So that's the feedback. It's pretty simple. We've had over 1.9 million participants participate in Test My Brain since 2008 in this model, so it's an effective recruitment strategy. And this is with basically no advertising at all. It's just been word of mouth, people sharing on social media, and then some press. So who comes to Test My Brain? This is a picture of the Earth at night. Lights are obviously, the yellow things are lights, which are population centers. And this is one study on Test My Brain. So you can see this is a very international sample. And in fact, we've tested someone at this point from every country and territory in the world, except for like a few in Northern Africa, including North Korea. We've had 3 people who come from North Korea, which are the only 3 people, I think, who have internet connections in North Korea. So that's a point of pride for us. Reasons for participation. Vast majority of people who are doing this are doing it to learn about themselves because they're interested in the mind and brain and for fun. It's the same sort of basic motivation that people do a lot of things on the internet because it's something that is interesting to do in your spare time. What I think is noteworthy, though, is that 2/3 of the people who come to Test My Brain are participating in a research study for the very first time. This is very different from things like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, where research participants are in some ways professional research participants. They do it all the time. They do it a lot. These people are not habitual research study participants. As you can see, we've had a number of publications at this point, over 24 using data from Test My Brain. We found that data quality is similar or in some cases even better than traditional samples because people are self-motivated and they're there because they want to be. And the data, in fact, produces results that replicate what you would find in traditional samples and including nationally representative ones in some cases. So I've talked a bit about measuring many, and I hope you have convinced you that this kind of research model can allow you to scale research in a way that is difficult to do otherwise. But what about measuring well? And I think if we're going to move to a place of precision medicine, we don't just need a lot of people, we need a lot of people who are well characterized. So this is the normal distribution. Many of you are familiar with it. If you're not, basic idea is that this is sort of population, people who are performing more poorly in the case of a cognitive test, people who perform very well, and people who are around the average level of performance. Our tests are really good at capturing people who are at the bottom end of the normal distribution. They're often developed either with a clinical context in mind or for a clinical context, and so that's what we care about. We want to capture people who are having problems. Our tests are really not good at capturing people outside of a sort of scholastic achievement sort of context, but in medicine and in health, we're really not good at capturing people who are at the upper end of the distribution. And that kind of makes sense, right? Like, if you're doing great, if you're really talented, if everything's wonderful, like, who cares? Just go away. Like, we're trying to deal with people who are ill. But the consequence of that, and the single-shot approach that we use, is that we can't tell, let me skip to this one, if someone is going from extraordinary performance to, a 3 standard deviation shift, and now they're not yet impaired, they don't have a deficit as we would define it in the clinic, but they have had a substantial change in functioning that probably profoundly impacts their life. And that's really, really, I think, a difficult thing for us to contend with. So how do you use the availability of many participants who are engaged, who are self-motivated, who are part of research, to drive the development of better assessments? So I think if you take a software development approach, and I say software development, this is done in many different areas, but I'm sort of using this as the prototype. When you make a measurement, when you make a new assessment, and with all the theory that's gone behind it and all the sort of deep thoughts you've had in the committees and the conversations, that thing you made is a prototype. You start there. After that, you do data collection with randomization, so things like A/B testing, where you have multiple forms, different hypotheses about what's going to work better or not as well, and you test them on people who are in the group that you're interested in. You evaluate on things like psychometrics, so how reliable or sensitive is the measure, but also things like engagement. Is this something that people are completing, or do they just drop out, or they find excruciatingly dull? Because if you're not going to be able to engage people, it's going to be really hard and very intensive to have a large research study. And then accessibility. Can this device reach people across sociodemographic groups and across device types even, in order to have as generalizable a sample as possible? So you evaluate on those things. You modify based on things you identify, and then you do the whole thing again. And you keep doing that again and again, iterating on the same assessment until you hit some set of criteria that you're using for what's acceptable engagement, what's acceptable accessibility, and what's acceptable psychometrics. And many tests, I think, really never make it out of this cycle because it's difficult to make tests have this sort of quality characteristics. I feel like I can't talk about this enough, but participant engagement is something that we don't tend to iterate on when we talk about tests and assessment. This is an example of something we discovered through A/B testing on Test My Brain. We had a study of postpartum depression that we called postpartum depression. And the idea is, do this survey if you're someone who has suffered from depression after giving birth to a child. We started then changing the titles of the study, so using different title types to see how that impacted engagement. And at a certain point, we hit on this one title, Calling All Mothers. And Calling All Mothers attracted 300% more women with postpartum depression than the equivalent, the same study, just different title and description underneath, that was called postpartum depression. And what's more, it wasn't just more people, but we were getting more women from underrepresented minority groups. So the way women think about themselves and their depression experiences was quite important in engagement here. And hitting on that right way, in some ways it was a call to action, of engaging that population was something that we would only have found through A/B testing because it was not something we a priori thought would be the case. So present to you kind of a challenge and opportunity. When we think of the Digital Research Lab and we think of the future of research in mental health, how do we build studies that are open to the public, open to the researchers, collaborative, that are personalized, so that are built to satisfy the goals and motivations of individuals, and that promote the sharing of information, the sharing with participants, the sharing between participants in patient communities. And it's a challenge, obviously, because we can't rest on the ways that we've been doing research for the last, centuries, because we're in a new world now. But it's also an opportunity, because this is the point at which we can now scale our science, make better measurements, and engage people in a way that wouldn't have been possible until the last few years. So I'd like to thank my laboratory, folks at the Institute for Technology and Psychiatry, and many, many Test My Brain volunteers. Thank you.